Hey guys, welcome to the lecture on the early Middle Ages. This is the second lecture of Unit 3, which is over the entire Middle Ages. In the first lecture we looked at a lot of the rise of early Christianity and the rise of the Islamic world in the 8th and 9th century. And today we're going to kind of be pushing a little bit past that, but also relatively around the same time period, talking about various groups that emerged in Europe in the 5th, 6th, 7th century, and even really up to the year, like 800 or 900. And so to begin, we're going to talk about the rise of the Franks and kind of the what Europe looked like after the Roman Empire fully dissolved. So if you look at this map, in Western Europe, around the year 475, Western Europe had totally kind of dissolved. The Roman Empire itself had disintegrated into small kingdoms. In 476 CE, the Roman emperor was actually overthrown, and like the western part of the Roman Empire basically fell apart. The eastern part of the Roman Empire, which will become known as the Byzantine Empire, is totally fine, right? That part is still going strong. This part right over here is still doing just fine. But this part over here, this Western Roman Empire, absolutely falls apart and basically gets divided up into competing kingdoms. And during this time period, because of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there's no central bureaucracy to kind of keep all of these kingdoms together, right? There's no cohesion between them. Under the Roman Empire, you would have an emperor and you would have a large bureaucracy and taxation and a military apparatus to kind of keep everything cohesive, to keep everything together. But now during this time period, in the 5th century, 6th century, that doesn't exist. The reason why the Byzantine Empire is still going strong, of course, is because it still had strong leadership, right? It had emperors like Constantine and Justinian. It had complex governmental structures that, benefited from taxation, had a large military and a large government bureaucracy that helped, keep the nation together, keep the empire together. Western Empire doesn't have any of that anymore, and so it basically falls apart into smaller competing kingdoms. And in this Western, formerly the artist formerly known as the Western Roman Empire, now you have this very personal form of politics that's going to develop in these small kingdoms. These kingdoms become incredibly militarized. The military power is might makes right is a good old saying for this. That military power is going to be how you flex your authority on other people, how you come to dominate your particular region. These small kingdoms are very dependent on plunder and expansion and charismatic leaders. Basically, leaders need to be able to convince people to obey them, right? To listen to them. And so you see, these kingdoms like the Franks and the Burgundians, and today we're going to particularly focus on the Frankish kingdom here. These guys are going to, the way that they continue to exist, the way they propagate themselves is to fight other groups and kind of steal their stuff. All right, so it's expansion by conquest. And that's how you bring people into the fold. That's how you convince people to continue to follow you, is that you conquer other groups and then show, and thereby showing your followers like, hey, we're strong, like we can continue to rule over this particular area. But it's a very rudimentary structure, right? It's not very sophisticated. It's simply, we're going to fight wars with the people next to us and beat them and then steal their stuff. And the problem is that when you base a kind of a political system on military conquest and military power without success, right? Without military successes and without good leadership, it's very, very difficult for those kingdoms to stay afloat. And so this western part of Europe during this era known as the early Middle Ages, you have a lot of unrest, a lot of chaotic situations, because there's just not enough, there's no cohesiveness to the region. And so the success of the kingdom, of course, depends on its ability to survive, right? Like, so this kingdom of the Franks that we'll talk about in a minute, its success depends upon military conquest and good leadership. Even if the ruler isn't that charismatic, if he can win battles, or even if he just has legitimacy, that will be enough, for the people. If he can convince people to obey him and convince people to continue fighting for him, then the kingdom survives. But if not, the kingdom falls apart and new leadership will take the place of the old. And so this was a time period, this early Middle Ages, of incredible unrest, an incredible chaos, and we'll talk a lot about that over the course of this lecture. And so, like I said, we're going to be focusing on the Franks, the Frankish kingdom, which is this area right here. If you're thinking about it in terms of the modern day, this is, of course, modern-day France. Modern-day France, of course, kind of stems all right here, including like the Burgundian region right here, and even part of what back then was still the kingdom of the Ostrogoths. But this is the kingdom of the Franks right here, a large kingdom that will be carved out of this kind of Western European region by a few very successful kings and dynasties. The first group to really knit together that Frankish kingdom is a group called the Merovingians. And to start talking about the Merovingians, we have to start with probably the most famous king of the Merovingians, named Clovis I. So the Merovingian dynasty starts in 481 CE, and Clovis was a pretty exceptional person. He became king at just the age of 15, and when he was crowned king, he then set out to conquer the area that the Romans called Gaul, which was this kind of like the northwestern region of the Roman Empire. One thing I want to note here about Clovis is note the long hair and the beard. We'll talk more about that here in a second. That becomes kind of a symbol of the Merovingian kings. We'll talk about them in a minute. But here's Gaul kind of writ large in the Roman Empire. These are the names that the Romans used. So this, Germania was that area where modern day Germany is, that the Romans were constantly fighting in under people like Marcus Aurelius. If you go a little bit to the southwest of Germania, you get to this area that the Romans called Gaul, kind of from down here, this Alps region, all the way up to what we now know as the British Channel right here. So this region there was a lot of different little ethnic groups, little different kingdoms that were present in this region. And Clovis set out to conquer this region, and he was a ruthless leader. There are even stories of him killing his own family members, like cousins, in order to kind of seize their territory and kind of add it to his own. Now, that seems shocking to us in the modern day, but back then, those sort of family killings were actually not that uncommon, because a lot of these leaders were often related and would be willing to go to war with someone in their own family, to take power over their region. And Clovis conquered territory in a very similar manner to the Roman Empire. And what I mean by that is that as these Frankish armies would kind of march into the territories that were around them, they would take over. They would fight wars and win, and then they would spread the spoils of war amongst their supporters, meaning that their soldiers and nobility would get, bonuses, right? Would get money, gold, slaves, whatever they conquered, they would kind of distribute amongst the people that had supported the king. And so this was a way to kind of earn loyalty, right? And this is very similar to what Julius Caesar did in Rome. And so the Franks are kind of continuing this forward. And so there's actually an English historian named Edward Gibbon who writes about this, talking about all these Frankish kingdoms that exist right here. And he's talking about how they conquered each other and kind of would use the spoils of war as a way to kind of curry favor with their supporters. And so Edward Gibbon, talking about Clovis, says, "When he first took the field, he had neither gold and silver in his coffers, nor wine and corn in his magazines, but he imitated the example of Caesar, and purchased soldiers with the fruits of conquest. After each successful battle or expedition, the spoils were accumulated in one common mass. Every warrior received his proportionable share, and the royal prerogative submitted to the equal regulations of military law. The untamed spirit of the barbarians was taught to acknowledge the advantages of regular discipline." And so Clovis conquered people around him and then distributed what was conquered land, valuables, food, distributed it to his soldiers as a way to keep them coming back, as a way to earn their support. And he was very, very effective as a military leader. And remember, that was one of the most important pieces I mentioned earlier of what it takes to be a king in this time period. Is you not only do you have to be willing to go to war, but you have to be successful, right? You have to be a successful military leader and conquer other groups. Otherwise, you'll be seen as stagnating, and your population might get restless, or you might get attacked by other more powerful groups. And Clovis actually is able to carve out this large Frankish kingdom all around this kind of Western European area. He defeats numerous other barbarian groups. And remember, we're using the term barbarian as just a way to refer to people who do not speak Greek. This is just the term that the Romans used to describe basically like non-Roman groups. And so the Franks, they conquer the Alemanni, they conquer the Burgundians, which are right here. They conquer some of the Visigoths down here in this Bordeaux region. The Alemannis are right here in this kind of eastern France region. So this makes Clovis a very powerful leader. And he has created this this quite large kingdom for himself. One of the most interesting things about Clovis, though, is not only is he successful as a military leader, but he's also quite successful as a religious figure. Clovis was raised pagan, was raised a non-Christian, but as king, he converted to Christianity. Some historians refer to Clovis as one of the last pagan kings, right? Meaning that at this point, Europe is entirely starting to transition to a Christian region. And his conversion to Christianity was important because it acted as a binding agent for society. Many people in Europe were already converting to Christianity, and so by converting himself, by being baptized and converted into the Christian manner, he was kind of effectively ensuring the loyalty of those Christians. So now not only was he a good military leader, but now he could also kind of position himself as a leader who was furthering the goals of Christianity. Plus, by being a Christian king, he was establishing connections with the Byzantine Empire, right? The eastern part of the old Roman Empire that was at this point a Christian empire as well. So in some ways this could be seen as a political move, right? This could be seen as a way to not only earn the favor of the people, right? The regular population in his kingdom, but also a way to kind of earn the favor of empires elsewhere that are also Christian. And so his conquests knit together this large kingdom that will become known as just the Frankish kingdom. We'll talk about the Carolingians in just a moment, but this is a good picture of the Frankish kingdoms here, and it was largely started by Clovis. Now, Clovis established a dynasty called the Merovingians, right? They ruled. Here, I'm going to flip back to that one. They ruled this kind of like what used to be the northwestern portion of the old Roman Empire, and Clovis, looking like this, kind of set the standard for what a Merovingian king would look like. They were usually war leaders. Clovis himself was comfortable in battle. They wore their hair long and their beards long, which was a symbol. Even the kings after Clovis wore their hair and beards long. And this became kind of a symbol of their linkage to Clovis. Like they were trying to mimic, the leader that came before them. But also, the long hair and the long beard could have been a symbol of like virility and power back then. Over the next couple of hundred years, though, the kingdom that Clovis creates is going to fall into a lot of chaos. When Clovis dies, the tradition back then, when the king dies, the tradition was to divide up the kingdom equally amongst all the sons. So Clovis had 3 sons, and he divided up his kingdom equally among them. And so you'd have 3 sons, and so now you have 3 different Frankish kingdoms, which are all kind of theoretically competing against one another. And when they die, they would do the same thing. They would divide up their kingdoms amongst their sons. And so it creates this really chaotic society. There's chronic violence between these competing kings. There's civil wars, of people trying to overthrow the king that they don't like. This whole region of Western Europe right here is incredibly unstable. There is a lot of instability related to violence, related to problems of succession. Who is going to be the next king? Is that king going to be as good as the one that came before him? And one of the biggest problems for kings during this period is that you're trying to control this massive area. And remember, this isn't the Roman Empire. They don't have tax collectors and bureaucrats and these sorts of things that help kind of control an empire. They didn't have any of that. And so they had to rely entirely on military force or, like their own character, their own kind of like cult of personality, so to speak. And one of the biggest problems for these kings was actually controlling their mighty servants, meaning people like the nobility that were just right beneath the king, who oftentimes controlled large pieces of land, who might have a lot of soldiers at their disposal. Kings struggled to control their most powerful supporters because you couldn't just fire them or cut their pay like you could in the British Empire, right? If the British Empire didn't like something a tax collector did, you just fire that guy and get a new one. Under this sort of political system, you can't do that, right? A king can't just fire a noble, right? Because that noble has his own support structure. The noble probably has his own kind of military force that he can bring to bear. And plus nobles aren't getting paid. They don't get paid by the king. They make money through conquest. And they were leaders of soldiers. And they controlled castles and land and fortifications. So these nobles didn't always need the help of the king, right? They could be self-sufficient in some cases. And they knew this. And so kings often struggled, particularly weak kings. Like Clovis did fine because he was a good war leader and an effective, he conquered a lot of land. But other kings who might not be as effective as Clovis really struggled to control their very powerful aristocracy. A lot of those aristocrats, those nobles, didn't want kings telling them what to do, and they wanted the title of their land, to go to their sons, which again, so there was like this very, like, to use kind of a modern term, a very balkanized sense of political power here. Is that the king might be the king, right? He might have the title, but his power base relies heavily on nobles supporting him. And if those nobles don't support him, all of a sudden you have a huge, huge problem in your kingdom. So maintaining this society, maintaining this Clovis empire, this Frankish empire, the Merovingian dynasty, relied on conquest. There was no taxation. The best way to make money was through plunder. But at a certain point, after Clovis and after some of his sons, the Merovingians kind of just stop expanding. The economy grinds to a halt, and when there's no expansion, when there's no conquest, because that was the basis of their economy, was conquest, bringing in new money by conquering other people. When that ended, all of a sudden there was no way to reward your supporters for their loyal service. Soldiers are loyal only because they want the spoils of war. They want to get wealthy by conquering. And if they're not conquering new territory and they're not conquering new land, then all of a sudden you have a leader who's going to lack legitimacy. And so about 100 years after Clovis, Clovis, of course, it dies in 511, and you have a series of rulers after him who are fine, who do perfectly fine. But then once you get to about 650 CE, you get this series of rulers that are ineffective. They're still Merovingians. They're still part of this Merovingian dynasty. They had the title of king. They had great prestige, but they were weak. They didn't really have any legitimacy. The nobles didn't buy in to their power. And legitimacy is really, really important, especially during this time period. And what I mean, I've used that word a lot now. What I mean by the term legitimacy is that people have to believe that that current leader should be the leader, right? People have to look at the leader and be like, that's the guy, right? That's the guy that should be leading us. If there are any doubts about that, that's a dangerous situation, especially for these kingdoms that were very militaristic and very violent. So whether that leader had legitimacy through getting elected or through conquest or through economic power, right, wealth, or even sometimes through hereditary rule, being the son of the former king was a form of legitimacy. The people had to believe that the king deserved to be the king and he was the legitimate king. If that legitimacy starts to be questioned, people start plotting against you. And over time, in this in the Merovingian dynasty, people start plotting against the Merovingian kings. So, let's talk about how the Merovingians kind of meet their end, and a group called the Carolingians will rise up. So here's the large Merovingian kingdom. All of this which is modern day France and part of modern day Germany, and also I think part of modern day Belgium. And there's other countries in there as well, I think. Switzerland, I think, is like right here. Anyway, so the Carolingians are a family that stems from this area, which back then was an area known as Austrasia. Austrasia is eastern France. It's this region right here. Western Germany, this area right here, and then the Low Countries, which are right here, which are like Belgium, part of the Netherlands. So the Carolingians were servants to the Merovingians. They were there's a term that they used back in the day called a mayor, which is M-A-I-O-R, the mayor, which normally when translated to English, to modern English, it means the mayor of the palace. It's actually where we get our modern term for mayor, like the mayor of the city of Houston, for example. And the mayor of the palace had a great deal of responsibility. They were the prime minister. They oversaw kind of relationships with other countries or with other kingdoms. In our modern day, they would be the defense secretary responsible for defending the kingdom. They were also usually a leader of soldiers. The mayor of the palace was probably the most prominent war leader in the kingdom, unless the king himself was also a prominent war leader. And so these mayors tended to be incredibly powerful people in the kingdom, and the title was hereditary, meaning that it passed down along the family line, going usually down the father's name. So a father would pass the title of mayor onto his son. And so the Carolingians were the mayors of the palace in the region of Austrasia, this region right here, which made them incredibly powerful. They had military power, they had good leaders, and they had a military that listened to them, right? And that made the Carolingians a budding political dynasty, because they had all the correct characteristics that you need to be politically powerful in this early Middle Age period. Additionally, the Carolingians also allied themselves with the church. They were a group of Christian people, and so they had that going for them as well. And in particular, the Carolingians will forge a relationship with the Pope himself, with Rome, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. But just remember that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, was very important, even at this time period, because he was the guardian of the sacred Christian relics. He was the seat of power in Rome, especially when the Roman Empire fell apart. The Pope became even more important because he was one of the only true leaders in that area. He had kind of inherited the city of Rome and became, in some ways, the leader of that city. He had even appropriated old Roman titles like Pontifex Maximus, the way of glorifying his own position. So here's the thing: the Pope had a lot of power, but he also was under constant threat. there was a barbarian tribe called the Lombards, which are right here. The Lombards are in this northern region of what is modern-day Italy, and they were constantly threatening the Pope and his rule of Rome, and threatening to take over Rome. And at first, the popes relied on the Eastern Empire. They relied on the Byzantine Empire for protection, because that was the traditional alliance, right? It was Rome and Constantinople, and those two cities, they worked together to kind of keep the Roman Empire together. But over time, gradually, that relationship is going to fray a little bit. The relationship between the Pope and the eastern part of the empire is going to fray to the point where the Pope starts looking for other people to defend him. And you may be wondering, like, why? Why would the relationship fall apart between the Byzantine Empire and the Pope? And it has a lot to do with religion. To make a long story really short, basically the Pope, and I think we talked about this a little bit in the last lecture, but the Pope kind of asserted a certain amount of superiority as one of the key bishops in the Christian church, partially because St. Peter had been the first bishop of Rome, and the Rome, of course, had the status of being the former imperial city. And so, but the bishops in the Byzantine Empire and in places like Constantinople would question the Pope's authority. They would debate various Christian doctrines and whether or not the Pope was correct. And so, the Pope, when the eastern part of the empire starts to become what become known as iconoclasts, fighting back against the western part of the church, the Pope starts to look for new allies. In the 720s and the 730s, he needs a new support structure. The Byzantine Empire is not helping him enough, especially with the threat of the Lombards right here in northern Italy. And so the question becomes, where's he going to go? He can't go east because that's where the Byzantine Empire is, and we've already talked about that. So instead, he's going to look to these kingdoms up here to provide him protection. And in particular, the Pope is going to forge an alliance with the Carolingians in this area of Austrasia. And you may be wondering why. Like, that seems so odd. These are barbarian kingdoms who are just newly converted to Christianity. And so why would the Pope forge, why would they make an alliance? Why would the Carolingians make an alliance with the Pope and vice versa? And the reason is that they both needed something out of the other. The Carolingians needed the Pope to ally with them because they needed legitimacy. The Carolingians wanted to be powerful. They had their eyes set on being on establishing their own sort of powerful dynasty. And what better way to do that than to forge an alliance with one of the most powerful figures in the Christian world, the Pope? They wanted to assert themselves as the defenders of Christianity, even more so than the Merovingians. And there was a lot of internal religious disagreements between the Merovingians, who were Christian, and the Carolingians, who were kind of a different strain of that early forms of Christianity. And so that's what the Carolingians got out of this alliance with the Pope, was legitimacy. They wanted to be seen as the defenders of Christianity. What did the Pope need? The Pope needed someone to defend him. And he needed someone to defend him from the Lombards. And the Pope also wanted to preside over Europe as a religious leader. He wanted more prestige as the leader, as the conduit for standing between God and the people, so to speak, and to advance the cause of the Christian Church, of course. So the Carolingians forge this alliance with the Pope and soon make a name for themselves as the defenders of Europe. In particular, the defenders of Christian Europe, right? At the Battle of Tours, the Battle of Tours is one of these battles that has become has achieved almost like a mythical status amongst people who study Western civilization. And that's because it was a battle between the Carolingians and the invaders from Moorish Spain. So there was this invasion of Muslims who were kind of coming through Spain, going north. And if you look at this map that I just had up, Tours is right here, where this big arrow is pointing right there. And so there's this region right here, which is the kingdom of the Visigoths. The Visigoths had been taken over, as we talked about last time, by Muslim cultures in northern Africa, and those Islamic cultures wanted to control the rest of Europe, right? They want to invade into Europe and control this area as well, to challenge the Christian barbarian kingdoms that are developing here. And at this site right here, the Battle of Tours, the famous king Charles Martel, who was the Carolingian mayor of the palace. He was the guy from Austrasia, right? He's the guy defending, the region from this invasion. And as this Muslim invasion goes north, they meet at this place called Tours, which is also called the Battle of Poitiers sometimes. And in this battle, Charles Martel, who is known as the Hammer, Martel being a hammer, Charles Martel the Hammer wins this battle. He and his forces push back the invasion and send the Islamic forces back into the Iberian Peninsula, back into Spain. And the Carolingians gain an incredible amount of prestige from this battle. They are seen as the defenders of Europe, in a way, the defenders of Christian Europe. And in particular, Charles Martel and the Carolingians gain a lot of authority from this battle, a lot of legitimacy, because the Merovingian king wasn't anywhere close to this battlefield, right? But the Carolingians were. And remember, winning battles, conquering, was an incredibly important part of being seen as a legitimate leader during this period. And the fact that, Charles Martel was out there fighting in the battlefields and winning this battle gained him an incredible amount of prestige. So, his son, this guy, his name's Pepin the Short. Pepin the Short inherits his father's position, so he is also the he is also the mayor of the palace. And he wants to solidify Carolingian power. He wants to, and essentially, overthrow the Merovingians. He wants to assume that title for himself, that, the king of the Franks, so to speak. And he writes to the Pope, he writes a letter, Pepin the Short writes a letter to the Pope and says, "Is it right for the man who holds power not to wear the crown, while the person who wears the crown does not hold the power?" Essentially saying, the Merovingian king wears the crown, but he's not powerful. I'm powerful. Shouldn't I be wearing the crown? Is essentially what he's telling the Pope. And what he's doing here is he's asking the Pope to support him. He's telegraphing to the Pope, I want to be the king here. The other guy doesn't have the support. I can be seen as a good Christian leader who will advance the cause of Christianity, and I want your support. In 751, Pepin overthrows the last Merovingian king, has him put away in a monastery. Also has the Merovingian kings, remember, had long hair and beards, and Pepin orders his beard and long hair to be cut because he's going to be a monk. He's going to be put into a monastery. And that was very degrading to the Merovingians. It was almost like removing his sacred qualities. 2 years later, after Pepin takes power and after overthrowing the Merovingian king, the Pope traveled to see him. The Pope traveled to see Pepin. That had never been done before. No Pope had ever traveled that far beyond the old Roman Empire. No Pope had ever traveled into Northwest Europe. But he was really, really desperate. Rome was under siege by the Lombards. You can see right here, the Lombards are this yellow area. Rome is right here, and you can see how Rome is. They're literally surrounded by the Lombards, and up here you've got the Franks, what is the Carolingian dynasty. And the reason why the Pope makes the trip up here into this Frankish kingdom, he's desperate. He's desperate. The Lombards are threatening to overtake Rome, threatening to basically to throw the Pope out. And in 753, during this trip, the Pope Stephen II crowns Pepin the Short king of the Franks. In return for his support, Pepin agrees to go and invade Italy. He's going to invade the northern part of the Italian peninsula. So like this, it's not even part of the peninsula, it's really the mainland, this part right here. Pepin says, I will go down there and fight the Lombards to try to give you some breathing room. And he does. This map right here shows all of the conquests of the Frankish territories. And this is the part that Pepin helped win during his reign. He helped defeat the Burgundians right here, and he also is going to help defeat some of the Lombards down here in this region. So if you look at his timeline, 751 to 768, 751 to 768 is this kind of like darkish green right here. So it's this area right here. And so he is able to help provide a little bit of breathing room for the Pope. The Lombards are still here, but now they're a little bit weakened. And so, to kind of summarize Pepin's rule and the rule and like kind of the rise of the Carolingians, Pepin helped kind of crystallize, bring together, or solidify this Carolingian legitimacy. You know, he helped create a legitimate kingdom that was not the Merovingians, but now a new line of people, the Carolingians. They already had that military leadership, you know, winning the Battle of Tours, but now they also had religious backing because the Pope supported them as well. And remember that Christianity had already swept through parts of Europe at this point. And so by kind of combining, but the Carolingians were able to fuse military power with religious power, making them an incredibly influential and powerful kingdom. And one of the interesting results of this, of the Carolingian dynasty and its alliance with the Pope, is that the papacy is going to shift to the north, meaning that the Rome, instead of having eyes towards the east in the Byzantine Empire, now Rome is going to pay much more attention to what's going on up here in northwestern Europe. You know, despite the fact that the Byzantine Empire out here was really its more natural ally, considering the old ties with the old Roman Empire. But Pepin just starts the dynasty. It's the next guy that's going to really push the dynasty forward. The guy who's going to really build up the Carolingian dynasty is a guy that some of you have probably heard of. His name is Charlemagne. So Charlemagne was the son of Pepin the Short. He was extremely tall for his time, which is interesting because his father was called the Short, which makes you wonder if like Pepin the Short's nickname was kind of a joke rather than if it was actually short. I don't know. But Charlemagne was around 6'5", apparently just a very large man, although known for having a very high voice, which was interesting because normally people that are tall have lower voices. He apparently loved baths, loved smoked meats, loved having his daughters around, although he didn't let them marry anybody. Charlemagne, though, was a man of his time. He was very, very comfortable being a warrior and a king. He led military campaigns year after year. And he was also a person of learning, though. He wasn't just a warrior. He also was a person who wanted to learn, or at least put a premium on learning. He was very religious, but that he didn't let his religious nature obstruct his enjoyment of life or waging of war. And he was not really a guy that was prone to introspection necessarily. He kind of just moved forward in whatever manner needed to happen. So he inherits Pepin's kingdom, and he is going to be the guy that's going to extend the legitimacy of the Carolingian kings. One of his advisors, a guy named Alcuin, told him that a king should be strong against his enemies, humble to Christians, feared by pagans, loved by the poor, and judicious in counsel and maintaining justice. And Charlemagne, I think, does a good job trying to embody all of those pieces of advice. And his kingdom in his leadership style are going to rely heavily on those three forms of legitimacy that we talked about earlier. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about legitimacy and the Carolingian kings and how they built themselves up as rulers over a large section of Europe. So one way that you build legitimacy as a king, which is one we've talked about already, is military conquest. And that is successful wars, right? Not just fighting, not wars of defense, but successful military campaigns against opponents. And man, Charlemagne was really successful. He conquered the Lombards in 1774. The light green color right here is all of the area that Charlemagne conquered. He conquered the Lombards in 1774, basically freeing the Pope of Rome from from underneath their heel, right? The Lombards had been threatening the Pope for a long time, and now the Lombards are part of Charlemagne's empire. He defeats the Avars in the 1790s. He seized so much treasure from the Avars out here in this eastern portion of Europe that it actually financed his whole kingdom until his death in the later years in 1814. He conquered various Germanic tribes, notably the Bavarians right here in 1788, and fought numerous campaigns against the Saxons up here from the 1770s through the 1790s. The fight against the Saxons was incredibly brutal and difficult and long. It involved intense civilian casualties and basically a virtual extermination of peoples up in that northern Germania region. After conquering the Saxons and other groups, he forced people to convert to Christianity. They were not allowed to retain their pagan religions, which was a little bit different than the Romans, right? The Romans usually combined Roman religion with kind of local religion, very similar to what the Greeks did. But in this case, Christian conquerors are going to enforce Christianity upon people, right? They're going to thrust Christianity onto these other cultures and making them convert. By the time of his death, and again, if you look back at the previous slide, 1774 to 1814 was his reign. By the time of his death in 1814, almost all of Germania was under his control, this area right up here. Now, there's some spots out here that are still kind of technically part of Germania that were not, but by and large, Germany was under Carolingian control. He also invaded parts of Spain down here into the Spanish Marches in Septimania. And so he was tremendously successful as a military leader. And remember, these leaders during this time period, what they would do is they would fight, they would conquer, and then they would distribute the spoils of war. They would distribute the plunder to people who supported them. And this was a way for them to maintain that allegiance, right? To curry favor with their soldiers. And as a result, Charlemagne was beloved by his subjects and by the people who fought for him because he was very successful at conquering and plundering and gaining wealth for the people who lived in his kingdom. The second part of legitimacy, so military conquest, got that one. He's definitely good there. The second part of legitimacy for Charlemagne was religion, and in this case, Christianity. Charlemagne was viewed as a Christian ruler. He was already in a line of Christian rulers like Pepin the Short, and he is going to help solidify that alliance with the Church of Rome. And in a way, because Charlemagne was a Christian king, he was sort of viewed as responsible for the spiritual health of his people. So not only was the conquering of other cultures important, but converting those people that were conquered to Christianity was equally important, because you're bringing new people into the church, even if you're forcing it upon them, right? You're bringing them in to the church. So in a way, Charlemagne kind of combined the role of spiritual leader with political or military leader. And that kind of brings us to the third piece of legitimacy that Charlemagne had, and that was the legacy of Rome. So there's an apocryphal story that, or at least maybe perhaps a legend of a story that goes that deals with Charlemagne. So the story goes like this: Charlemagne was in Rome. He had gone to Rome. He had just rescued the Pope from various Roman factions in the city that didn't like the Pope. And this was on St. Peter's Day. St. Peter, of course, being the first Roman Pope, right, the first Bishop of Rome. And so on St. Peter's Day, he goes to the church to pray. It's Christmas Day. It's not St. Peter's Day. It's Christmas Day, and he goes to St. Peter's Church on Christmas Day. He goes there to pray. And the Pope surprised him, kind of like jumped out and surprised Charlemagne and puts a crown on his head and crowns Charlemagne the emperor of the Franks and kind of just the emperor of Europe, so to speak. Declared him the emperor of his kingdom. And Charlemagne, in hindsight, had said, and this is also part of the legacies that are like the legend. Charlemagne said that he wouldn't have gone to Rome if he'd known he was going to be crowned emperor. He said he didn't want to be crowned emperor, but it's like, is that true? Like, does Charlemagne not want to be emperor? Like, probably not. Like, I'm sure Charlemagne would have been fine being the emperor. It's easy to be cynical, right? But let's think about like what this moment means, because the moment did happen. Charlemagne did get crowned by the Pope. Now, exactly how that crowning happened is kind of like up for historical debate, but the fact is that Charlemagne did get crowned emperor by the Pope. So let's think about this moment and what it means. There's a couple of things going on here. One, when you get crowned by somebody, there's a power imbalance happening, right? The person who's getting crowned is usually on a knee, like in this picture, and they have someone else placing the crown on their head. And so in this image, the person with the real power is the Pope, right? It's the guy holding the crown and placing it on the other person's head, right? So in this case, like Charlemagne would be the lesser of the two figures, which is interesting because Charlemagne had just bailed the Pope out. It looks like the Pope is more powerful, and in fact, this moment is an important one because later popes will claim that only they can really bestow political power upon various kings or empires. And so for years in the future, popes will use this moment as a way of saying, we are the true deciders of who the legitimate rulers of Europe are. And in fact, later on, this is in a different class in Western Civ 2, Napoleon actually is going to get crowned by the emperor when he is the king or like the leader of France, dictator, I suppose, of France, goes to get crowned by the emperor and actually snatches the crown out of the Pope's hand. I'm sorry, he's going to get crowned by the Pope, and he snatches the crown out of the Pope's hand and puts it on his own head because he didn't want anybody to think that the Pope was more powerful than Napoleon. Another problem with this moment, or at least another consequence of this moment, is that it angered the Byzantine Empire. I remember that the Byzantine Empire is still over there, right? And Constantinople kind of saw itself as the person who's carrying on the legacy of Rome. In fact, Constantinople, of course, had once been New Rome, right? It was the new capital of the Roman Empire. Now you have a new emperor being crowned in Rome. And so there's like this rift, this break that exists between Rome and Constantinople. This is a moment where the Pope is kind of claiming a little bit of political prestige for himself, and it causes a lot of like a schism, a division between the Roman Pope and the patriarchs out in the east in places like Constantinople. But so Charlemagne combines these three types of leadership. It's Roman, Christian, and military. And they all give him legitimacy as the true king. Of the three, the legacy of Rome is probably the most important, or at the very least the most like impressive, because the Roman Empire it still lingered in the mind of people, right? Like the glory of old Rome. But it was probably the least significant during this era because the Roman Empire was just not that important. It was not that powerful, right? The Roman Empire had basically ceased to exist in the West. And so being the guy who was carrying on the legacy of ancient Rome was seen as prestigious and impressive, but in terms of like real power, probably not that important. The name still evoked greatness, though. The idea of being the emperor representing, old Rome had a certain amount of symbolic weight to it. So nevertheless, Charlemagne is the emperor. He is not just the king of the Franks, but now he is the emperor of this large area that will soon become known as the Holy Roman Empire. That's what's happening here, is that we are slowly creating the Holy Roman Empire, which is going to be a major component of the next lecture. This empire that will exist in Central Europe. Charlemagne rules from the city of Aachen up here, and this area that he has kind of crafted for himself is a large empire. It's to this day, or I'm sorry, not to this day, but no person ruled over this much of the West since the Romans, right? So under Charlemagne, we have the largest kind of consolidation of land that hadn't happened since the Roman Empire. And even up to our modern moment, the only other people who consolidated this much land under one empire were two people. It was Napoleon in the early 1800s. For a brief moment, Napoleon conquered large parts of Europe, and then Hitler in the 1940s conquered large parts of Europe, but only held it for a handful of years. So think about that, right? That this moment in the 1770s and into the early 800s, this is one of the largest empires Europe saw up until the 1800s, right? So this is a significant moment. But Charlemagne's empire wasn't an empire in the way that we think of them. It was more of like a collection of people and clans. When we think of an empire, we think of the Romans and the Greeks and how they had these large bureaucracies that connected various parts of the empire, and that the empire was kind of politically united under one system. In this case, that's not really how it worked. The empire was very, very divided amongst like small nobles, the various clans that kind of ruled certain areas in the empire itself. And in fact, to try to help run the empire, Charlemagne tries to kind of create a sort of bureaucracy. He divides up the empire into like some 600 counties, each run by a dude named a count. And these guys were kind of responsible for running their particular county. They would publish royal orders and resolve legal disputes, collect taxes, raise troops and stuff. But the problem is that Charlemagne's empire is just absolutely massive, and only having 600 counts means that the counties that they're controlling are just huge. And so considering the size of the empire, there just simply wasn't enough of like a government apparatus to run the empire itself. So under Charlemagne was a strong king and a well-respected king, but the authority of this central government was weak throughout the empire, right? Charlemagne himself could command respect, but throughout the empire, once you kind of get down into these local regions, local leaders had a great deal of influence, more so than any sort of like central government from, the capital of Aachen. Society was held together more by alliances between these powerful families that ruled these areas, rather than any sort of big governmental system like what you had in the Roman Empire. In the Carolingian Empire, the cities in the Carolingian Empire, places like Aachen and Verdun and Cologne, these are small cities. They had cities, but they were small. Even Aachen, the political center of the whole empire, buildings are made out of wood and earth. The streets were muddy and narrow. Beggars were a common sight. So the society was very divided. The aristocracy, meaning like the nobility, the clergy, the people who ran the churches, they lived very well. They ate well. The government pumped money into monasteries, and so the clergy did just fine for themselves. Gained educations as they had to learn how to read Latin and lead church services. And in fact, scholars refer to this time period as the Carolingian Renaissance, because Charlemagne pumped so much money into education, particularly through the churches, that it established Latin as a kind of like the common language amongst the educated elites. However, for everybody else, for people who weren't part of the educated elite, for people who weren't part of the clergy, life was rough, man. Life in Carolingian society was really, really difficult for the people who weren't part of that educated aristocratic elite. Most people lived in rural areas or like isolated estates. They could easily be wiped out by the plague. Their food could be wiped out by the weather. clothing was simple. The disease was very common, and of course they didn't have modern medicine to deal with the same maladies that we have today. Work was very demanding. These are people who toiled the land and worked with their hands, and struggled for everything that they had. And even when that didn't return very much to them, right? They worked every day for their life and just didn't get a lot for it. They had very little to no education, spoke local languages. It was all oral, nothing written down. So for the church and some of the aristocrats, sure, they're experiencing a renaissance, a Carolingian renaissance, as the Carolingian kings like Charlemagne are pouring money into educational institutions, and in particular the church, to teach the clergy how to read Latin and how to transcribe the old masterpieces. On the other hand, everybody else struggling. In fact, Thomas Hobbes, who is an English philosopher, would later write a book called The Leviathan, and this is much later in the 1500s. We're not gonna we'll talk about him at a later date, but he, looking back at the Middle Ages, Thomas Hobbes is talking a lot about in the Leviathan about life during this kind of time period where things were very chaotic and there wasn't really a large, strong, centralized state. And he said in his book, The Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes wrote, "Whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by the sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." That was how Thomas Hobbes saw the Middle Ages in some ways, this era in which there wasn't a lot of culture or education or artistics or art or inventions or and everything was fearful, and everybody kind of feared the constant war, and that last line of life being nasty, brutish, and short, and it very much became kind of a shorthand for describing the Middle Ages, because there's no central authority to bind people together. Even though Charlemagne was the emperor, the life of the little people, they had very little security. So next time we're going to talk about the High Middle Ages, and we'll talk a little bit about the Holy Roman Empire, but mostly I believe we're going to talk about England and France and use them as case studies to look at the High Middle Ages and talk about the growing power of the church in Europe. So thank you guys so much for tuning in to this lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys next time.